The podcast opens with a critical examination of the Russia Gate scandal, which Charlie Kirk and Tucker Carlson describe as a manufactured and confusing political narrative that dominated media discourse for years. Kirk highlights how the story seemed to emerge suddenly, painting Donald Trump as a Kremlin agent, a claim that was unprecedented and lacked substantive evidence. This narrative, according to Kirk, was not only misleading, but also served to desensitize the Democratic Party and its base to a deep-seated animosity toward Russia, which later influenced their stance on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Kirk further explains that Russia Gate was more than just a political scandal. It was a strategic tool used by intelligence agencies and political operatives to undermine Trump's presidency. He points to the infamous insurance policy, text messages between FBI agents Peter Strzok and Lisa Page, as emblematic of a covert effort to surveil and sabotage the Trump campaign. The scandal's fallout, Kirk argues, has had real-world consequences, including prolonging conflict in Ukraine and fostering a climate of distrust toward American institutions. He expresses hope that ongoing investigations, particularly those led by Tulsi Gabbard, will bring accountability to those responsible for this abuse of power. A significant portion of the discussion centers on the role of U.S. intelligence agencies and what Kirk terms the deep state. He asserts that these agencies have evolved into an unaccountable fourth branch of government, operating beyond civilian oversight and often acting against the interests of the American people. Kirk laments that the original purpose of these agencies, to protect national security, has been subverted into political interference, particularly in elections. Kirk criticizes the lack of effective civilian control over intelligence agencies, highlighting the Senate Intelligence Committee's failure to rein in abuses. He points to figures like Senator Tom Cotton as emblematic of this problem, suggesting that personal and institutional conflicts of interest undermine oversight. The podcast underscores the urgent need to lance the boil of the administrative state to restore democratic accountability and prevent further erosion of sovereignty. Transitioning from political intrigue to economic realities, Kirk delves into the profound economic anxiety gripping young Americans, particularly those under 30. He identifies economic insecurity as the primary concern for this demographic, overshadowing cultural or social issues. Kirk paints a stark picture of a generation burdened by soaring housing costs, rising rents, and a deteriorating currency that has eroded purchasing power over time. He contrasts the economic landscape faced by his parents' generation, where home prices were roughly 3 times the average income, with today's reality where homes cost 7 times the average income. The age of first-time homebuyers has risen from 30 to 38, signaling a delayed and diminished path to economic independence. Kirk argues that this economic dislocation fuels political radicalization as young people become increasingly cynical and desperate, seeking alternatives to the status quo. Kirk introduces the relatively new but rapidly expanding financial trend of buy now, pay later, BNPL services, which he describes as a predatory debt mechanism disproportionately affecting Generation Z. Unlike traditional credit cards, BNPL services allow consumers to finance everyday purchases, from groceries to concert tickets, without credit checks or regulation by credit bureaus. Kirk warns that this creates a subterranean debt market that traps young people in cycles of high-interest payments and late fees. He emphasizes that many young consumers are not using BNPL to indulge, but rather to meet basic living expenses, underscoring the severity of their financial distress. Kirk criticizes both the lenders exploiting this vulnerability and the borrowers caught in the trap, calling for regulatory intervention to shut down these loopholes. This financial dynamic, he argues, exacerbates economic inequality and undermines the prospects for wealth building among younger generations. A striking theme in the conversation is the hyper-feminization of the modern economy and education system, which Kirk believes has alienated many young men. He explains that the growth sectors of the economy increasingly emphasize pink-collar jobs, roles centered on empathy, communication, and norm enforcement, that do not align with traditional masculine traits such as risk-taking and creation. This shift has contributed to higher unemployment rates among young men compared to women and a growing sense of purposelessness. Kirk connects this economic feminization to broader social consequences, including declining marriage and fertility rates. He notes that women are less likely to marry men who earn less than they do, creating a feedback loop where economic disenfranchisement leads to social fragmentation. The podcast highlights the psychological toll on young men, many of whom withdraw from society, contributing to rising rates of suicide and social isolation. Kirk does not shy away from assigning blame for the current economic crisis, pointing squarely at the baby boomer generation. He argues that boomers have benefited disproportionately from economic policies and asset inflation over the past several decades, often at the expense of younger generations. This intergenerational wealth transfer has left millennials and Gen Z worse off than their parents at the same age, a historic anomaly. He critiques boomers for their perceived selfishness and failure to address systemic issues such as housing affordability, student debt, and wage stagnation. Kirk acknowledges that while not all boomers are culpable, the generation as a whole has prioritized its own prosperity, leaving a fractured and disordered economy for their descendants. This economic betrayal, he warns, risks fueling political instability and social unrest. The podcast also tackles the crisis in higher education, which Kirk likens to a medieval institution more focused on growing endowments than serving students. He condemns the ballooning student loan debt that burdens young Americans, arguing that colleges have become hedge funds with schools attached, prioritizing financial growth over educational outcomes. Kirk questions the value of many degrees, especially those in fields that do not lead to gainful employment. He calls for accountability and reform, suggesting that universities should be held responsible for the economic damage caused by their policies. The student debt crisis, Kirk contends, is a key factor in the broader economic malaise affecting young people, limiting their ability to build wealth and participate fully in the economy. Kirk highlights a profound disconnect between Republican elected officials and the young voters they purport to represent. He cites figures like Senator Lindsey Graham as emblematic of a political establishment out of touch with the economic and cultural realities facing younger Americans. Kirk stresses the importance of realigning political representation with the priorities of the electorate, particularly on issues like immigration, economic opportunity, and cultural values. He describes efforts by his organization, Turning Point Action, to engage in primaries and support candidates who better reflect the concerns of young conservatives. Kirk warns that failure to address this disconnect risks alienating a vital voting bloc and undermining the legitimacy of the political system. Immigration policy emerges as a critical battleground in the podcast, with Kirk expressing strong opposition to amnesty proposals currently circulating in Congress. He warns that such measures would undermine recent gains in border security and deportation efforts, effectively rewarding illegal immigration and incentivizing further violations. Kirk criticizes politicians like Maria Elvira Salazar for promoting what he calls pathways to dignity that amount to de facto amnesty. Kirk advocates for robust enforcement, including the deportation of millions of undocumented immigrants, and emphasizes the importance of securing the southern border. He also critiques the refugee system as a distorted application of Christian charity, arguing that it has been weaponized by the left to facilitate demographic change. Kirk stresses that immigration policy must prioritize the interests of American citizens and preserve national sovereignty. The conversation broadens to consider the cultural and demographic shifts occurring in Western countries, particularly the United Kingdom. Kirk observes that mass immigration has led to a decline in morale and a sense of national identity among native populations. He contrasts the secular, conquered state of modern London with the vibrant, confident societies of Gulf Arab nations, suggesting that immigration has a corrosive effect on both immigrants and host communities. Kirk warns that this demographic transformation amounts to a form of ethnic replacement, which he views as deeply destabilizing. He argues that Western nations must confront these realities honestly and resist policies that facilitate cultural erosion. The podcast frames this issue as central to the future cohesion and survival of Western civilization. Amidst the economic and cultural turmoil, Kirk identifies a hopeful trend: young men returning to church, particularly to ancient and traditional forms of Christianity, such as Catholicism and Orthodoxy. He suggests that faith provides a vital source of meaning, purpose, and community for men who feel alienated by modern society. Kirk emphasizes that spiritual renewal is essential to reversing the social decay associated with economic disenfranchisement. He encourages young men to embrace religious teachings, marry, and build families as a path to personal and societal restoration. Kirk frames this spiritual dimension as a counterbalance to the nihilism and despair that pervade much of contemporary youth culture.